Hey everyone, happy Wednesday. Today we're going to be talking about fractions and percents. The last couple of days we have talked about fractions and decimals and fractions and how to transfer between both of those. And today we're going to throw percents into the mix. So today by the end of the class you should know what is a percent, and you should know how to take a fraction and make it a percent, and how to take a percent and make it a fraction. So make sure you're paying attention closely today. I am going to turn my camera off for most of the time today because I want you to be able to see the full smartboard. So make sure you're rewatching any section that might give you any trouble and follow along very closely to my examples as I go through them. So here we go. Let's get into percents right here. So the first thing we're going to talk about is how to use a 10 by 10 grid in order to find a percent and to make it more visual. So a 10 by 10 grid is basically just talking about a grid that has 100 pieces in it. So this grid right here, this is a 10 by 10 grid that has 100 pieces because we have 10 blocks up top, 10 blocks on the side. If you do 10 by 10, that's going to equal 100 altogether. So when we're talking about percentages, we're typically talking about a number over 100, okay? Because we want to talk about percentages out of 100 because it makes sense when we talk about percentages. So when we're talking about 25%, it says 25% means how many out of 100? Well, that really just means 25 out of 100. So if I interview 100 people about their favorite pizza type, and 25 of them say that it's pepperoni, that means 25% of the people chose pepperoni. And then it says, shade the squares, fill it in one column at a time. Shade blank squares out of 100. Well, we know we want to shade 25 squares. Well, don't make it hard on yourself right here, because I know that each of these rows is going to equal 10, right? So if I have this column or this row, that's going to be equal 10 right here. If I do another one, that's going to equal 10. And then I only need 5 more because I know 10% is 20, so I just need 5 more. So 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So now I have just shaded 25 squares out of the 100 altogether, which means I have shaded 25% of this grid. So it says, what fraction of this 10 by 10 grid is shaded? Well, I know that I shaded 25 over 100 pieces. But I know that with fractions, we like to make those simpler. So let's say I tried to take a 5 out of here, because I know that 5 is a factor. I can divide the top by 5, I can divide the bottom by 5, and that's going to equal 5 over 20, right? Because I have 25 divided by 5 is 5, 100 divided by 5 is 20. Well, I know that I can take another 5 out of these two numbers. So if I did that again, 5 divided by 5 is 1, over 25 divided by 5 is 4. So really, the percentage that we shaded was just 1/4 of this grid. And if you're looking over here, if I shaded that, I see that it's about 1/4 of this 100 grid right here, the 10 by 10 grid. And then it says, if I have 1/4 here, what decimal represents the shaded part? Well, I know with decimals, I really want to think about tenths place and hundredths place and things like that. So if I looked at this one, 25 over 100, I know that that is really like saying 0 and 25 hundredths. So now I have a decimal, I have a fraction, and I have a percent, all with 25. Good. All right, let's keep moving on. So when I'm doing percents, instead of using the 10 by 10 grid, I could also use a bar. So if I looked at a bar chart here, so this is the bar, all right, I first had to figure out how many pieces my bar is split into. So in this case, it is split into 10 pieces, right? And I see that, and it might be kind of light on your screen, but that it says 1, 2, 3, 4 of them are shaded. So if 4 of the 10 bars are shaded, that means that 40% of it is shaded, because the full bar would be 100%. So if each bar is 10% and 4 of them are shaded, that means 40% of the bar is shaded altogether. So now let's look at this bottom one here. It says model 60% with a bar diagram. So it says the bar diagram below is divided into how many equal sections. So let's just count up the sections. We know that the full bar is going to be 100%. Well, let's count how many sections they broke it down into. We got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So there are 5 equal sections to this bar. So that means that the value of each section is going to be 20%. Because if I take 100% and divide it by 5, that's going to give me my 20. So that means this bar is 20%, this bar is 20%, this one's 20, this one's 20, and this one's 20, which is going to equal 100 altogether. But I want to figure out 60, right? So how many of these bars am I going to have to shade in order, how many sections of this bar am I going to shade to get to 60% right here? Well, I know that 20% plus 20% plus 20% equals 60%. So that means I need to shade in 3 sections of this diagram. So I can shade in 1, 2, 3. So that means I just shaded 60% of the bar. I know it's a little messy, So that's kind of what we're doing when we're using bar diagrams to figure this out. All right, keep it moving. All right, so if I were to get something like this, I want to figure out the percentage using a 10 by 10 grid, or I want to find the percentage using a bar graph. So, or bar diagram. So this is pretty easy right here. So if I'm looking at this first one, I know that this is a full row. And in a full row, if they're all shaded, that means that there's 10. This is a 10 by 10. So that means there's 20 here, 30, 40, 50 altogether, because each of these is worth 10. So that means 50 total blocks are shaded out of this 100. So if 50 blocks are shaded out of 100, that means 50% of this 10 by 10 grid is shaded. So you can use a 10 by 10 grid to kind of look at that. Or I can use this bar chart here. So I'm going to first count, remember, how many bar sections I have. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So they took this bar and they split it up into 10 different parts or 10 different sections. So that means that each of those sections is worth 10%, right? So this section is worth 10%, this is worth another 10%, and so on. So if you could see on your screen, I know again it's a little light on the smartboard here, but on my screen, this amount is shaded. What? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So 8 of those bars are shaded. So if I knew that 8 of those bars were shaded, boom, that means that 80% of this bar graph or bar diagram is shaded. Okay, so this is an example of using a 10 by 10 grid and using a bar diagram to solve a percentage problem. Okay, now I want you to try. I want you to figure out how many of these pieces are shaded out of the 10 by 10 grid, and then figure out what percentage that would be out of 100. There's 100 total blocks. I want to figure out how many yellow blocks are shaded and what the percentage of yellow blocks shaded is. Okay, if you did this correct, you should notice that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up top, 2, 3, 4, 5 on the side. So 5 times 5 is 25. So there's 25 pieces shaded. So that means 25 out of 100 pieces are shaded, which means the answer should have been 25% of this 10 by 10 grid is shaded. Okay, now I want you to try one with the bar graph, the bar diagram here. So on this one, I see that this is broken down into 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces. And if you can't see on your screen, they have shaded in 1, 2, 3 of these pieces. So I want you to answer right now, how much of this bar diagram is shaded? What percentage of this bar diagram is shaded? All right, you did this correctly. Since it's broken down into 4 pieces, that means each of these pieces is worth 25%. Okay, because 100 divided by 4 is 25. So this is 25%, this is 25%, this is 25%, and this is 25%. So if I have 25% plus 25% plus 25%, that's where my shading stops. That means 75% of this bar diagram was shaded. So hopefully you got that one correct. All right, so now let's get into the chapter that we have refreshed our brain on percentages here. So the first thing you might be asked to do is shade a certain amount out of what it asks you in the problem here. All right, so remember, with percentages, we always want to make them over 100. We always want to make that denominator 100. So for this first one, it says basketball. And I see basketball over here as well, right? So basketball, it says 3 out of 20. So then for each sport, it says shaded 10 by 10 grid that represents the number of students out of 100. So if 3 out of 20 students chose basketball, how many would that be out of 100? Okay, well then all I have to do is figure out how to get from 20 to 100. So if I was going from 20 to 100, I would do 20 times 5, which means I'm going to get to 100. So that means 3 times 5 up here, which means that 15 out of 100 choose basketball. So I know now how to shade 15 out of 100 on here. So I can shade this row or column right there. I can shade this column. Oh, I went too far, right? Because if I did a full another column, this is going to be 20. So instead, I need to actually take that first column, get to 10, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then shade right there. So 15% of people chose basketball. Now we have football. Let's look at football here. So football, it says 3 out of 25 people chose football. Now, how do I get from 25 to 100? Well, to get from 25 to 100, I'm going to multiply by 4. So that means I have to multiply the top by 4, which means 12 students would choose football. So I'm going to now shade the first column there. That's 10 plus 2, because 10 plus 2 is 12. So that means 12 students would choose football. Now, when we get to gymnastics, it says only one student out of 20 chose gymnastics. So again, I want to make this 100. So how am I going to get from 20 to 100? Again, I'm going to multiply that by 5, which means I multiply the top by 5. So 1 times 5 is 5. So that means only 5 students out of 100 chose gymnastics. So that means I'm shading 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's all I'm going to shade there. And then the last one that they're going to have as an option is swimming. So if I'm looking at swimming here, I see that 9 out of 100 people chose swimming. Well, this one's easy already because I don't even have to change anything with the denominator. So that means all I have to do over here is shade 9 of these boxes. So I go up here, I get there, and I make sure I don't leave that bottom box out. So if I had a denominator that was not 100 already, you need to try to find a way to change that denominator to be 100. Okay, hopefully you followed along with that pretty well. All right, now let's get into what lesson 3 is going to ask you to do. So this first example, it might ask you to write a percentage as a fraction in simplest form. So if this one says write 50% as a fraction in simplest form, 50% means 50 out of 100. That's what we just worked out, right? So that means 50% is going to be 50 shaded out of 100 pieces. And then if you want to put that in simplest form, all right, I'm taking 50 over 100. Well, I know that I can divide by 50 for both of those, which is going to eventually take me to 1 over 2. So the simplest form of 50% is going to be 1/2. Okay? So you just have to find a way to reduce it until simplest form to get that fraction there. All right? Another thing they might ask you is in a story problem or a word problem. So it says, in a recent survey, 55% of cell phone owners said that they text message. What fraction of cell phone owners is this? So we know that percentages are always over 100. So this is 55 people over 100. So 55 out of 100 equals, and then I have to find a way to make that 100 simpler, right? So I have to simplify this fraction, which you see over here, they simplified it to be 11/20. The way that they did that is they divided by 5 up here, divided by 5 up here, which is going to leave us with 11 over 20. Okay? So again, just a story problem, but we're just finding a way to simplify those fractions once we put them over 100. All right, so I want you to try a couple here. So let's start with 75%. What is 75% as a fraction in simplest form? Make sure you don't forget about simplest form. Okay, if you did this correctly, you should have started off with 75 over 100, but that was not the answer. You needed to figure out a way to bring that even lower. So if you know anything about money and quarters, we know that 3 quarters equals 75, and we know that quarters also go into a dollar, so you should have known that 25 is a factor. Or you could have divided by other numbers until you got to the simplest form. But 75 divided by 25 is 3. 100 divided by 25 is 4. All right, so that means the simplest form of that first one is 3/4. All right, try another one. Let's try this one, 90% here. What is that as a fraction in simplest form? All right, we should have started with 90 over 100. All right, and this one should be pretty easy because we know that there's a 90 and 100. I can divide this by 10, and I can divide this by 10, right? So if I divide 9 by 10, 90 divided by 10, I'm going to get 9. If I divide 100 divided by 10, I'm going to get 10. So the simplest form is going to be 9/10. All right, the last one, try 38%. All right, for this one, you should have gotten 38 over 100 to start. I'm just going to take out a 2 because I see that they're both even numbers, which is going to give me 19. So 38 divided by 2 is 19. 100 divided by 2 is 50. Boom, that is the simplest form there. So hopefully that is making sense, taking a percentage, putting it over 100, and then bringing it to simplest form. Another thing you might get asked to do, it says the table shows the percent of each movie type rented during a month. What fraction of the rentals were action movies? Well, I see over here that action movies is 35%. Okay? So again, all I have to do is take that percentage, put it over 100, 35 over 100, and then simplify. Well, I know that 5 goes into both of these again, which is going to bring us down to 7 over 20. So that means 7/20ths of the time people rented action movies. So if I was using that same chart, how can I figure out, let's try another one on your own. Okay, so if I was using that same chart, write the fraction of rentals that were horror movies. So if I was looking here, horror movies. So find horror movies in the table here. And then what would that be as a fraction in simplest form? Okay, if you did this correctly, you should see that horror movies has 5%. So that means 5 out of 100, because we always put our percentages out of 100. So if I have 5 over 100, I'm just going to divide by 5, because I know that 5 goes into both of those numbers, which is going to leave me with 1/20. So that means 1/20th of the people chose horror movies. Okay, so hopefully you're following along and this is making sense. To me, I think that percentages and fractions is a little bit easier than what decimals and fractions was. Okay, just a couple more here. Write this fraction 6/8 as a percent. So if you're given the fraction, could you turn it into a percent? And the answer should be yes, you can. So if you have 6 over 8, for example, I want to make this denominator something that works well with 100. Right now, 8 does not work well with 100. But luckily, if I divide by 2 to both of these, I'm going to end up with 3 over 4. Now, 3/4 does work well with 100. Because if I have 3/4, I know that 4 times 25 gives me 100, which means I have to times 25 up here, which means I'm going to end up with 75 over 100. And if I find out 75 over 100, that means I know that 75 over 100 is technically just 75%. So 75% of this bar is shaded, right? As you can see here, 75% of this bar diagram is shaded. Okay. I'm going to skip that one, and I want you to just talk about this one last one here. So if we were given a story problem like this is example 5. Mitch made 12 out of 40 shots during the championship game. Pretty good. What percent of his shots did Mitch make? So we want to figure out how much percentage of his shots he made during the championship game. So we start off with 12 over 40 equals 3 over 10. Right? The reason we're bringing it down to 10 is because 10 works nicely with 100, right? So if I divide by 4 to both of those, I'm going to get 3/10, which is our simplest form of 12 over 40. Now, if I have 3/10, I know I can easily get from 10 to 100 by multiplying by 10. So if I multiply by 10, I get to 100. 3 times 10 is going to give me 30. So now I have my nice pretty number over 100. So 30 over 100 is what we were looking for, which means that he made 30% of his shots. So this is the final problem that I want you to try. So on your own, look at this problem and try to put it over 100 and then figure out what the percentage would be. So Alana spelled 19 out of 25 words correctly. What percent of the words did Alana spell correctly? So try to figure out how to make this fraction over 100, so the denominator would be 100, and then turn it into a percentage. Okay, if you did this correctly, you should have realized that 25 times 4 equals 100, which means I have to do 19 times 4. If you don't know how to do 19 times 4, you can do that out to the side. 9 times 4 is 36. I'm going to put my 6 down and carry my 3. 4 times 1 is 4, plus 3 is 7. So that means that 19 times 4 is 76. So 76 out of 100 means that Alana spelled 76% of her words correct. All right, guys, we will talk about this more in class tomorrow and with your activities tomorrow, but I hope you learned a lot today. Have a great Wednesday, and let me know if you have any questions.